Perched on a hilltop 1,500 feet above the Pacific Ocean, silhouetted against the California sky, stands something that shouldn't exist. A structure so vast, so improbable, that even today it defies easy explanation. This is Hearst Castle, a monument to ambition that consumed nearly 3 decades to build and was never truly finished. 165 rooms sprawl across the estate. Twin towers pierce the coastal fog. Terraces cascade down the hillside like stone waterfalls, and for nearly 50 years, this isolated fortress served as the private kingdom of the most powerful media baron America had ever known. There was a time when zebras roamed these hills, when Hollywood's biggest stars walked these corridors with a mixture of awe and unease, when shiploads of European antiquities arrived at the California coast, destined for a mansion that refused to stop growing. This wasn't just a mansion, it was a world built by one man. To understand Hearst Castle, you must first understand where it stands. San Simeon is not Beverly Hills. It's not even close to Los Angeles. In the early 20th century, this stretch of California coastline was about as remote as American land could be. A wild, wind-swept expanse where the Santa Lucia Mountains meet the sea. There were no paved roads leading here, no neighboring estates, no infrastructure to support the kind of construction Hearst had in mind. The nearest city of any size was hours away by primitive roads that turned to mud in winter. Building here made no practical sense whatsoever. And yet, this isolation was precisely the point. Hearst didn't want convenience. He wanted dominion. He wanted a place where the outside world existed only by invitation, where every vista belonged to him, where the horizon itself seemed like a possession. The Pacific stretches endlessly to the west, the mountains rise dramatically to the east, and atop this particular hill, with 360 degrees of commanding views, William Randolph Hearst would spend 28 years and millions of dollars constructing his vision of paradise. The location wasn't chosen despite its remoteness. It was chosen because of it. William Randolph Hearst was not simply wealthy. He was the owner of an empire that shaped how millions of Americans understood their world. At the height of his power, Hearst controlled 28 newspapers, 18 magazines, radio stations, movie studios, and news services that reached from coast to coast. His publications could make or break political careers. They influenced public opinion on everything from wars to presidential elections. Hearst himself served in Congress and attempted multiple runs at higher office. He was courted by presidents, feared by rivals, and read by millions every single day. This was the era of yellow journalism, when newspapers weren't just reporting news, they were creating it. And Hearst was the undisputed master of the form. His papers thrived on sensation, scandal, and stories bold enough to sell papers by the thousands. Some historians argue that Hearst's coverage helped push America into the Spanish-American War. Whether true or not, the claim itself reveals the magnitude of his influence. By the time he began building his castle, Hearst wasn't just rich. He was a force that shaped the national conversation, and he wanted a home that reflected that power, something beyond anything America had ever seen. But the story of Hearst Castle doesn't begin with wealth or power. It begins with a boy and his mother on a camping trip. In the 1870s, long before William Randolph Hearst became a media titan, he was simply the son of George Hearst, a mining magnate who had acquired vast stretches of California ranch land. Among these holdings was a 40,000-acre tract along the San Simeon coast, wild, beautiful, and essentially uninhabited. Young William would travel there with his mother, Phoebe Apperson Hearst, a woman of refined tastes and cultural sophistication. They would camp on the hilltop, overlooking the ocean, surrounded by nothing but grassland and sky. Phoebe exposed her son to art, to European culture, to the idea that beauty and refinement were worth pursuing with the same intensity that his father pursued gold and silver. And somewhere during those trips, a promise took root. One day, William told his mother he would build something magnificent on this hill, something worthy of the view, something that would transform this remote wilderness into a center of culture and power. It was a child's dream, but William Randolph Hearst never stopped dreaming. When his mother died in 1919, Hearst inherited the San Simeon land. He was 56 years old at the peak of his empire, and he finally had the means to fulfill that childhood promise. Within months, construction began. The castle was, in many ways, a monument to his mother, a way of honoring her memory and her influence on his life. But it would become much more than that. It would become an obsession. To bring his vision to life, Hearst needed an architect of exceptional skill. He found one in Julia Morgan, a woman who had already shattered barriers in a profession that rarely welcomed her gender. Born in 1872 in San Francisco, Morgan had fought her way into the male-dominated world of architecture through sheer brilliance. As a young woman, she'd been told repeatedly that architecture was no career for a lady. Engineering schools refused to admit her. Professional organizations wouldn't consider her membership, but Morgan persisted with a determination that would define her entire career. She studied civil engineering at the University of California, Berkeley, one of the few women in the program, and proved herself to be among the top students. Then she set her sights on the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, the most prestigious architecture school in the world. The school didn't accept women. Morgan applied anyway. She was rejected. She studied independently, mastering French and improving her portfolio. She applied again, and again. Finally, on her third attempt, she was admitted, the first woman ever accepted into the architecture program. The École des Beaux-Arts was notoriously difficult. The curriculum emphasized classical design, rigorous draftsmanship, and complex engineering problems. Students worked under intense pressure, competing for prizes and recognition in a culture that valued tradition and technical excellence above all else. Morgan excelled. She completed projects that amazed her instructors, and in 1902, she became the first woman to receive an architecture degree from the school. Returning to California, she faced new challenges. The state licensing board had never licensed a female architect. Morgan passed the examination with flying colors and became the first woman licensed to practice architecture in California. She opened her own firm in San Francisco and immediately began winning commissions. By the time Hearst approached her in 1919, she had already completed hundreds of buildings across the western United States. She designed churches, schools, hospitals, private homes, and commercial buildings. She'd become known for her mastery of reinforced concrete, a relatively new material that required both engineering expertise and architectural vision to use effectively. When the 1906 San Francisco earthquake devastated the city, many of Morgan's buildings stood while others crumbled, a testament to her structural understanding. But Hearst Castle would be her masterpiece and her greatest challenge. Morgan was disciplined, precise, and technically gifted. She understood engineering as well as aesthetics. She could solve problems that would have defeated lesser architects. And crucially, she had the patience and professionalism to work with a client as demanding and mercurial as William Randolph Hearst. Their collaboration would span nearly 3 decades. It was unlike any typical architect-client relationship. Hearst had opinions on everything, every door, every tile, every statue. He would send Morgan telegrams filled with ideas, changes, new directions. He would return from trips to Europe with sketches and photographs, demanding that elements be incorporated into the design immediately. He would change his mind about completed work and insist on demolition and rebuilding. A typical telegram from Hearst might read, "Saw wonderful doorway in Seville, must have something similar for north entrance. Also, thinking assembly room ceiling should be higher. Can we raise it 3 feet? Arriving Tuesday to discuss." Morgan would receive dozens of such messages, each one requiring careful consideration, structural analysis, and diplomatic response. Most architects would have walked away. Morgan stayed. She translated Hearst's chaotic vision into structural reality, managing the impossible logistics of building on a remote hilltop while accommodating her clients' endless revisions. She made weekly trips to the site during the most intensive construction periods, reviewing work, solving problems, conferring with contractors. She maintained a full-time office in San Francisco, while essentially running a second office at San Simeon. She was also a brilliant problem solver. When Hearst wanted the Neptune pool to be larger, Morgan had to redesign the entire terrace structure to support the additional weight. When ancient Roman columns arrived that were too short for their intended location, Morgan designed custom pedestals that elevated them while appearing historically appropriate. When Hearst acquired a ceiling from an Italian palace that was the wrong dimensions for its intended room, Morgan modified the room to accommodate the ceiling, altering walls, adjusting proportions, making it work. Her drawings for the castle number in the thousands, detailed plans, elevations, sections, and specifications that document every aspect of the construction. She kept meticulous records, maintained detailed correspondence, and managed budgets that ran into the millions of dollars. She supervised craftsmen, negotiated with suppliers, coordinated shipments from across the world, and through it all, she maintained her professionalism and her vision. She didn't just execute Hearst's whims, she shaped them, refined them, made them buildable. She was, in many ways, the unsung hero of Hearst Castle, the disciplined mind that gave form to one man's boundless imagination. Morgan never married, never had children, and devoted her life to her work. Hearst Castle consumed more of her time and energy than any other project, but she never complained publicly. Years later, when asked about the experience, she would say simply that it had been the most challenging and rewarding work of her career. Without Julia Morgan, Hearst Castle would have remained a fantasy. With her, it became reality. Construction began in 1919 with a fundamental problem. There was no master plan. Hearst didn't commission a finished design and then build it. Instead, he began with a vague idea and let the castle evolve organically, room by room, year by year. The initial concept was modest by Hearst's eventual standards, a main house and a few smaller buildings. But as construction progressed, Hearst's ambitions expanded. Guest houses became palaces in their own right. A simple pool became a Roman temple. The main residence, which Hearst called La Casa Grande, grew into a sprawling complex with towers, terraces, and wings that seemed to multiply of their own accord. Workers hauled materials up the mountain on narrow roads barely wide enough for trucks. Limestone was quarried locally, but most materials had to be shipped in. Tons of marble, tile, ironwork, and timber transported from across California and beyond. A concrete mixing plant was built on site. Rail lines were laid. An entire construction infrastructure was created just to support Hearst's vision. And through it all, Hearst kept changing his mind. Rooms were redesigned before they were finished. Wings were added. Entire sections were demolished and rebuilt because Hearst had seen something in Europe he liked better. The project had no fixed endpoint because Hearst never wanted it to end. The castle wasn't a destination, it was a process, a way of life. Julia Morgan would later estimate that she spent more time on Hearst Castle than any other project in her career, returning to the site repeatedly over 28 years. Always adapting, always problem-solving, always building. Hearst Castle defies architectural categorization. Walk through its rooms and you'll encounter Spanish Revival arches next to Gothic fireplaces, Mediterranean courtyards, opening onto terraces lined with Roman statuary. It's a collision of styles that by all logic shouldn't work, and yet somehow does. The twin towers of La Casa Grande rise like Spanish cathedral spires, inspired directly by the Church of Santa Maria la Mayor in Ronda, Spain. But step inside and you'll find Renaissance ceilings imported from Italian palaces, French tapestries hanging on the walls, and ancient Greek sculptures standing in alcoves designed specifically to showcase them. The exterior presents a Mediterranean fantasy. White limestone walls, red tile roofs, bell towers that catch the morning light. The main facade features a grand entrance flanked by carved stone columns with twin towers rising symmetrically on either side. From a distance, the building could almost pass for a Spanish mission church grown to impossible proportions. But look closer and you'll see details that no mission ever possessed. Carved saints from medieval cathedrals, Renaissance bronze doors, Gothic tracery windows salvaged from European monasteries. Inside, the assembly room exemplifies the castle's eclectic magnificence, The ceiling is a 16th century Italian masterpiece, carved and gilded, depicting mythological scenes in extraordinary detail. The walls are hung with 16th century Flemish tapestries, each one large enough to cover a modern apartment wall. The fireplace is French Gothic, carved from limestone with such intricacy that it resembles lacework in stone. And scattered throughout are ancient Greek and Roman sculptures, standing on pedestals as if in a museum. The refectory, where Hearst hosted his famous dinners, is perhaps even more dramatic. The room stretches nearly 80 feet in length, with a ceiling from an Italian monastery soaring overhead. Long tables run the length of the space, flanked by choir stalls from a Spanish cathedral. Furniture meant for monks now serving as seating for movie stars and politicians. Banners hang from the walls, silk flags from Siena's paleo horse race, adding splashes of color to the medieval atmosphere. Morgan brought her Beaux-Arts training to bear on this chaos, imposing just enough order to make it livable. She understood proportion, light, and flow. She knew how to make a room feel grand without feeling cold, and she knew how to incorporate Hearst's eclectic acquisitions into a coherent whole, even when those acquisitions arrived with little warning and no clear place to go. She also solved extraordinary technical challenges. The hilltop had no water source, so Morgan designed a system to collect rainwater and pump it from springs far below. The castle had to withstand earthquakes, so she incorporated steel reinforcement into the concrete structure, innovative for its time. The rooms had to accommodate not just Hearst's collections, but also modern conveniences like electric lighting, central heating, and eventually even telephones and elevators. The result is controlled chaos, a mansion that feels like a museum that feels like a fantasy grounded in stone and mortar. Every hallway reveals something unexpected. Every turn brings another surprise. The castle doesn't follow rules. It creates its own. This was Hearst's aesthetic philosophy in physical form. Take the best of everything, combine it without apology, and create something that exists nowhere else on Earth. If Renaissance Italy produced the finest carved ceilings, then acquire them. If Spanish churches had the most beautiful towers, then copy them. If Roman emperors built spectacular bathhouses, then build one better. The castle became a sort of greatest hits collection of Western architecture, all remixed and reimagined on a California hilltop. William Randolph Hearst didn't just build a castle, he imported history itself. Throughout the 1920s and 30s, Hearst was one of the world's most aggressive buyers of European art and antiquities. He dispatched agents across the continent with instructions to acquire anything exceptional. Entire rooms were purchased from crumbling palaces and monasteries, disassembled piece by piece, shipped across the Atlantic, and reassembled on the California coast. The refectory at Hearst Castle features a ceiling from a 16th century Italian monastery. The Gothic study contains choir stalls from a Spanish church. Ancient Roman mosaics were laid into the floors of the pools. Doors, windows, columns, and fireplaces, some dating back centuries, were pulled from their original context and given new life in San Simeon. This wasn't mere collecting. It was architectural plunder on an almost unprecedented scale. Hearst saw himself as a preserver of culture, rescuing artifacts from decay and giving them a new home. Critics saw something closer to cultural imperialism, a wealthy American using his fortune to strip Europe of its heritage. Both perspectives contain truth. Hearst undoubtedly saved many pieces that might otherwise have been lost to neglect or war. But he also removed them from their historical and cultural contexts, turning living history into decorative objects for his private pleasure. Warehouses in New York and California overflowed with Hearst's acquisitions. He bought faster than he could build, accumulating so much that much of it never even made it to San Simeon. After his death, it took years to inventory and disperse his collections. Some items are still being discovered in storage today. At Hearst Castle, these fragments of European history became part of something new, a uniquely American creation that celebrated the old world while asserting the dominance of the new. If there's a single image that defines Hearst Castle in the popular imagination, it's the Neptune Pool, a vision of aquatic grandeur so extravagant it barely seems real. The pool stretches over 100 feet in length, framed by a Greco-Roman colonnade and populated by marble statuary depicting Neptune, god of the sea, surrounded by nymphs and mythological creatures. The facade rises behind it like a temple, all white marble and classical proportions, perfectly positioned to catch the California sun. But here's the remarkable part. This wasn't Hearst's first attempt. The Neptune pool you see today is actually the third version. Hearst built it, tore it down, rebuilt it larger, and then tore it down again and rebuilt it once more, each time expanding the scale and refining the design. The final version wasn't completed until 1936, 17 years after construction on the castle began. This is Hearst's perfectionism in its purest form. Most people would have been satisfied with the first pool. Hearst kept rebuilding until it matched the impossible image in his mind. The Roman pool, located indoors beneath the tennis courts, is equally stunning, but entirely different in character. Here, the aesthetic is Byzantine rather than classical. Walls and floors covered in intricate glass tile mosaics in deep blues and golds, creating the impression of an ancient bathhouse transported from Constantinople. The tiles were manufactured by a firm that had created mosaics for cathedrals and palaces across Europe, and the attention to detail is extraordinary. Even the underwater lighting was revolutionary for its time, designed to make the pool glow like a sapphire at night. The grounds extend this theatrical vision across acres of terraced gardens. Statuary lines every path. Roman senators, Greek athletes, Italian Renaissance figures, all arranged with careful attention to sightlines and symmetry. The gardens themselves are an exercise in Mediterranean planting, with cypress trees, palms, and flowering shrubs chosen to evoke the landscapes of Spain and Italy. Every element was designed to create an experience, to transport visitors out of California and into some timeless realm where beauty and grandeur were the only considerations. Walking through these spaces, you weren't just at a wealthy man's home, you were in his private universe. And then there were the animals. At its peak, Hearst Castle was home to one of the largest private zoos in America. Zebras, camels, kangaroos, ostriches, emus, and dozens of other exotic species roamed the hills around the estate. There were aviaries filled with rare birds. There were big cats in enclosures, leopards, lions, even bears. Hearst had acquired the world's largest private collection of wild animals, and he kept them on the mountain. For guests arriving at the castle, the experience began miles before they reached the main house. The drive up the winding hilltop road took visitors past herds of zebras grazing alongside cattle, through landscapes that looked like African savannas or Australian outback. It was surreal, deliberate, and effective, a way of signaling that normal rules didn't apply here. The zoo served no practical purpose. It was pure display, pure power, a way of demonstrating that Hearst could possess not just art and architecture, but life itself. If he wanted zebras in California, he would have zebras in California. If he wanted to look out his window and see ostriches, then ostriches would be there. Maintaining the zoo was expensive and logistically complex. Specialized keepers were employed full-time. Food had to be trucked up the mountain. Veterinary care was required. But cost was never a consideration. The animals were part of the spectacle, part of the kingdom Hearst had built for himself. After Hearst's death and the transfer of the property to the state of California, most of the animals were sold or donated to other zoos, but some descendants of Hearst's original zebras still roam the hills around San Simeon today, a living reminder of the zoo that once was. To be invited to Hearst Castle was to enter a world of carefully orchestrated glamour. During the 1920s and 30s, the guest list read like a who's who of American power and celebrity. Movie stars, studio executives, politicians, writers, and industrial titans made the pilgrimage to San Simeon, often staying for days or even weeks at a time. Charlie Chaplin was a frequent guest. So were Clark Gable, Cary Grant, Greta Garbo, and countless other Hollywood legends. Winston Churchill visited, President Calvin Coolidge came. Charles Lindbergh, fresh from his transatlantic flight, was entertained on the hilltop. These were the people who shaped culture and politics, and they all wanted to see Hearst's castle. But being a guest at San Simeon came with rules. Hearst ran his castle like a benevolent dictator, and everyone was expected to follow his protocols. Cocktail hour began at precisely 7:30 in the assembly room. Dinner was formal, with Hearst presiding at the head of a long table in the refectory. After dinner, guests were expected to attend a movie screening in Hearst's private theater, often featuring films that hadn't yet been released to the public. The theater itself was another marvel, a full cinema with seating for 50, equipped with the latest projection technology. Hearst had connections to all the major studios through both his publishing empire and his relationship with Marion Davies, who remained a working actress through much of the 20s. First-run films would be screened, sometimes with directors or stars in attendance to discuss the work. It was private cinema at its most exclusive. During the day, guests were largely left to their own devices, free to swim, ride horses, play tennis, or explore the grounds. The three guest houses, Casa del Mar, Casa del Monte, and Casa del Sol, provided accommodations that would have been considered palatial in their own right. Each was essentially a mansion in miniature, with multiple bedrooms, living spaces, and private terraces. Some guests preferred the intimacy of the guest houses to the grandeur of the main building. The castle's staff numbered in the dozens during peak periods: cooks, housekeepers, gardeners, animal keepers, maintenance workers, and personal servants. They maintained the fiction that this extraordinary place ran effortlessly, that meals appeared as if by magic, that pools were always clean, and gardens always bloomed. Behind the scenes was an industrial operation, but guests saw only perfection. But guests were always aware that they were performing for their host. Hearst watched everything, noted everything. He was gracious but controlling, generous but exacting. He would join conversations, offer tours of new acquisitions, share stories about his travels and collections. But there was always an evaluation happening, a sense that you were being judged against the other brilliant and powerful people who had walked these same halls. There were other rules, too. Hearst disapproved of drunkenness, so alcohol was limited despite the era's reputation for excess. A single cocktail before dinner, wine with the meal, perhaps a cordial after. No more. He expected punctuality at meals. Guests who arrived late to dinner would find Hearst had already started without them, and the social chills could last for days, and he absolutely demanded that guests respect his longtime companion, Marion Davies, a former actress who served as the castle's unofficial hostess. Davies was often underestimated by guests who didn't know her well. She was much younger than Hearst, decades younger, and some dismissed her as merely a showgirl who'd caught a rich man's eye. But those who spent time at San Simeon learned otherwise. Davies was witty, kind, and had a talent for putting people at ease that balanced Hearst's sometimes intimidating presence. She organized activities, smoothed over social awkwardness, and ensured that even the shyest guests felt welcomed. The castle functioned as well as it did in large part because of her efforts. Many guests found the experience exhilarating. Others found it exhausting. The castle was undeniably magnificent, but there was something oppressive about it too, a sense that you were always on display, always being judged, always in someone else's carefully constructed fantasy. Some visitors came once and never returned. Others became regulars, returning year after year to experience this unique world that existed nowhere else on Earth. William Randolph Hearst's need for control extended to every aspect of the castle's construction and operation. He wasn't content to hire talented people and let them work. He had to be involved in every decision, every detail, no matter how small. His telegrams to Julia Morgan are legendary for their specificity and frequency. He would send messages about the color of a particular tile, the placement of a statue, the design of a door handle. He would order changes to rooms that had already been completed, sometimes requiring walls to be torn down and rebuilt. He would return from trips abroad with new ideas that would send the entire project in a different direction. This wasn't the behavior of someone who simply wanted a nice house. This was the behavior of someone for whom the building itself had become a form of self-expression, an externalization of his own mind. Every room, every object, every vista was a reflection of Hearst's taste, his knowledge, his power. To accept something as finished was to accept limitation, and Hearst never accepted limitation. Julia Morgan adapted to this working style with remarkable patience, but it must have been maddening. She was a brilliant architect, accustomed to solving problems and completing projects. Hearst kept her in a state of perpetual revision, always building, always changing, always reimagining. The castle, in this sense, was never meant to be finished. It was meant to be an ongoing expression of Hearst's will, a physical manifestation of a personality that refused to be contained or constrained. As long as Hearst was alive and had money to spend, the castle would keep evolving. This is why, even after 28 years of construction, parts of the castle remained incomplete when work finally stopped. It wasn't a failure of planning or execution. It was the inevitable result of a vision that had no endpoint. The Great Depression changed everything. When the stock market crashed in 1929, even William Randolph Hearst wasn't immune to the consequences. Hearst's empire had always been built on aggressive expansion and heavy borrowing. During the boom years of the 20s, this strategy worked brilliantly. Banks were happy to loan money to a media titan whose properties generated enormous revenue. Hearst spent lavishly on newspapers, on real estate, on art, on construction, confident that income would always exceed expenses. But when the Depression hit, advertising revenue collapsed. Newspapers that had been profitable became liabilities. Magazine subscriptions plummeted. The movie studios he'd invested in struggled, and suddenly, Hearst found himself in a position he'd never experienced. He owed more than he could pay. By the mid-1930s, Hearst's financial situation had become dire. He owed tens of millions of dollars to banks and creditors. His collections, those rooms and artifacts he'd spent decades acquiring, had to be liquidated. Art dealers descended on his warehouses, purchasing at fire sale prices. Entire shipments of treasures were sold without ever being unpacked. The castle itself became harder to maintain. Staff was reduced. Construction slowed and then stopped on many projects. The grand vision that had consumed nearly 2 decades was suddenly subject to the harsh realities of economics. Hearst, who had always controlled everything, now had to watch as others made decisions about his empire. Trustees were appointed to manage his finances. Properties were sold. Publications were shuttered. The man who had shaped American media found himself sidelined by accountants trying to save what remained of his fortune. Work at San Simeon continued intermittently through the late 30s, but the pace had slowed dramatically. The Depression had revealed something that Hearst had never wanted to acknowledge. Even his wealth had limits. By 1937, construction at Hearst Castle had reached a crossroads. Some projects were completed, others were abandoned midstream. Still others existed only as plans that would never be realized. The castle's main structures were largely finished, but Hearst had always envisioned more. There were plans for additional guest houses, more elaborate gardens, even a grand entrance complex that would have transformed the arrival experience. None of these would be built. Workers who had spent years on the project began to be laid off. The constant activity that had defined the hilltop for nearly 2 decades began to slow. By the early 1940s, active construction had essentially ceased, though small projects and maintenance work continued sporadically. The Second World War brought further complications. Materials became scarce. Labor was diverted to war industries, and Hearst himself was aging, his energy and attention flagging. The castle that had consumed so much of his life for so long was simply left in its current state, magnificent but incomplete, a testament to both ambition and the inevitable constraints of reality. Walking through certain sections of the property, you can still see evidence of projects that were started but never finished. Foundations laid for buildings that were never constructed, gardens planted but never fully developed. Rooms that exist in a state of partial completion, frozen in time. These incomplete spaces aren't flaws, they're part of the story, proof that Hearst's vision was always larger than what any single lifetime could accomplish. William Randolph Hearst left San Simeon for the last time in 1947. He was 84 years old, his health failing, and the remote hilltop estate had become too difficult for him to navigate. He moved to a more modest property in Beverly Hills, modest by his standards anyway, where he could receive better medical care and where Marion Davies could look after him more easily. The castle, which had been the center of his life for so long, became a memory. Hearst died in 1951, never having returned to San Simeon. In his final years, he was a shadow of his former self. The empire diminished, the influence waned, the body frail. But the castle remained exactly as he'd left it, a monument to what he had been. There's a poignancy to this ending that's hard to ignore. Hearst spent decades building a dream palace, pouring his fortune and his energy into creating something unprecedented. And then, in the end, he simply had to leave it behind. The castle that was supposed to be his kingdom became something he could visit only in memory. Marion Davies inherited the property initially, but the costs of maintenance were overwhelming. In 1957, the Hearst Corporation donated the castle and its surrounding land to the state of California with the stipulation that it be preserved and open to the public. The private world became a public monument, the kingdom became a museum, and William Randolph Hearst's unfinished dream found a new purpose. When California took possession of Hearst Castle, they inherited both an architectural treasure and a logistical nightmare. The property required constant maintenance. The collections needed to be cataloged and preserved. The buildings needed restoration work that would take decades to complete. But they also inherited something invaluable, a piece of American history that captured an era of wealth, ambition, and excess unlike anything before or since. The decision was made to preserve the castle as closely as possible to how it appeared during Hearst's lifetime. Rooms were kept in their original configurations. Furnishings remained in place. Even some of Hearst's personal items were left where he'd last placed them, creating the eerie impression that he might return at any moment. The castle opened to public tours in 1958, and the response was immediate. People were fascinated by this glimpse into a world they'd only imagined. Movie stars and presidents had walked these halls. History had been made in these rooms, and now, for the price of admission, anyone could see what Hearst had built. Over the decades, Hearst Castle has become one of California's premier tourist attractions, drawing hundreds of thousands of visitors annually. It's been featured in countless films, documentaries, and books. It inspired Orson Welles' Xanadu in Citizen Kane, itself inspired by Hearst's life. The castle has transcended its origins to become a cultural icon, a symbol of American ambition, excess, and the complicated relationship between wealth and beauty. Preservation work continues today. Rooms are constantly being restored, collections are being researched, and new discoveries are still being made about the construction, the contents, and the stories behind this remarkable place. Stand at Hearst Castle today, and you're standing in multiple eras at once. You're in the 1920s, when Hollywood's golden age was just beginning. You're in Renaissance Italy, surrounded by artifacts that witness centuries of European history. You're in ancient Rome, looking at mosaics that predate America by millennia. And you're in the present, one visitor among thousands who make the pilgrimage up the mountain every year. The castle has taken on new meanings in the decades since Hearst's death. It's a monument to a particular kind of American ambition, the belief that anything can be built, anything can be bought, anything can be possessed if you have enough money and will. But it's also a cautionary tale about the limits of that ambition, about dreams that grow too large to be contained. Film crews still come to shoot here, drawn by the dramatic architecture and stunning vistas. Scholars study the collections, the construction techniques, the social history. Tourists wander the rooms with audio guides, trying to imagine what it must have been like when this was someone's home. The zebras still graze on the hills below, descendants of Hearst's original herd. The Neptune pool still gleams in the sun. The twin towers still rise above the fog, but the private kingdom has become public property, the exclusive retreat now accessible to anyone willing to make the drive. This transformation, from private fantasy to public monument, may be the most interesting chapter in the castle story. Hearst built it to be exclusive, to be his alone. Instead, it became something larger than he imagined, a piece of shared cultural heritage that belongs to everyone and no one. Every great house tells a story about its era, and Hearst Castle tells several at once. It's a story about the Gilded Age extended into the 20th century, about wealth so vast that practical considerations ceased to matter. When you can afford to import entire rooms from European palaces, when you can maintain a private zoo for your own amusement, when you can spend 3 decades building a home that's never quite finished, you're operating in a realm beyond normal human experience. It's a story about the American relationship with Europe, the simultaneous admiration and appropriation that defines so much of our cultural development. Hearst didn't just appreciate European art and architecture, he claimed it, transported it, made it his own. The castle is America asserting itself as Europe's equal, proving that New World money could possess Old World culture. It's a story about control and the limits of control. Hearst controlled newspapers, influenced elections, shaped public opinion. But he couldn't control time. He couldn't control the economy. He couldn't control his own mortalities. The castle stands as both a testament to his power and a reminder of its boundaries. And it's a story about obsession, about the human tendency to pour ourselves into projects that grow beyond reason or necessity. Hearst didn't need a castle with 165 rooms. He didn't need imported monastery ceilings or multiple versions of the same pool, but he needed to build them, needed to keep creating, needed to transform his vision into physical reality no matter the cost. The castle represents the best and worst of American ambition, the creativity, the boldness, the willingness to attempt the impossible, but also the excess, the ego, the assumption that money can solve any problem and buy any dream. Hearst Castle was never completed, not because of time, though time certainly played its role, not because of money, though money eventually ran short. It was never completed because the dream behind it never had limits. William Randolph Hearst spent 28 years building a monument to his own imagination, and even that wasn't enough. There were always more rooms to add, more objects to acquire, more visions to realize. The castle was never meant to be finished. It was meant to be ongoing, a perpetual project that would consume and define his life. What remains is something remarkable and strange. A private world made public, a fantasy made tangible, a dream built in stone that outlived the dreamer. Hearst wanted to create something that would match his power and his vision. He succeeded beyond what even he might have imagined, not because the castle is perfect, but because it isn't. Its incompleteness is part of its power. The unfinished sections, the abandoned projects, the dreams that never materialized, these make it human. Visit Hearst Castle today and you're not just seeing architecture and art. You're seeing the physical manifestation of a single human consciousness. One man's attempt to shape a mountain to match his imagination. That he didn't quite succeed makes it no less impressive. That he tried at all makes it unforgettable. The towers still rise above the Pacific. The pools still gleam in the California sun. And somewhere in the silence between the rooms, you can almost hear the echo of a promise made by a boy to his mother on a camping trip more than a century ago. One day, I'll build something magnificent here. He did.